We're going to continue on with our next story focused on the Summit of the Future, which is taking place in New York City, September 21st to the 23rd, just 60 days away, and still way too many people are painfully unaware of this event and the potential for the United Nations to declare a planetary emergency, not to mention take some major steps to creating either a new organization, an international global governance organization, or to modifying the UN Charter to make it even stronger so they can push us closer to world government. Many people have been aware for months and made a big stink the last year or so about the World Health Organization pandemic treaty, pandemic agreement, and people went to Geneva to protest, to rally, but there is very little noise being made at all about the Summit of the Future, if anybody knows. So I'm doing my part to kind of trumpet this issue, and I encourage you guys to share this with your friends and family so that more people are aware of this. Now, if you go to go to theconsciousresistance.com and you search Summit of the Future, you're going to find this article that I published back in April, which got a lot of traction, was translated to Spanish, and I'm very proud of it. If you want to get a primer, then you can go back and check that out. Today is based on my new article that's going to actually be published in the morning. It's not even published at The Last American Vagabond yet, so you're getting a sneak peek. Of course, if you're watching this or listening to this later, it's already at thelastamericanvagabond.com. But I wrote this article back in April titled "The Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future Will Rapidly Expand the Technocratic Takeover." And if you don't know the term technocracy, you're not familiar with it, again, go to the website, search technocracy. Go to theconsciousresistance.com/how-to and download my book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, which gives you a history and background on the technocracy movement and also how it relates to our current world and what's coming soon. Let's look at the new article, though. And since it's not published, you're looking at the back end of the TLEV website. So I'm just going to show you guys this. Sorry, it's ugly, but I need to be able to read what I wrote today because it's pretty fresh. I titled it, "The UN Will Sign the Pact of the Future in 60 Days. Here's Why It Mattered." And I'm just going to hit a few different key points and update you guys. This article, like I said, will be out tomorrow. In September, the United Nations 79th General Assembly will host the highly anticipated Summit of the Future, where nations are expected to sign the Pact of the Future, which represents a major step towards the creation of a one world government. And I know that's some crazy right-wing paranoia. Nobody's trying to work on a one world government, they tell us. But there sure do seem to be a lot of people talking about it while you're not paying attention. So the UN's meeting in New York City for their 79th General Assembly. This is an annual assembly. And as part of that, they're having this Summit of the Future. And again, they're going to sign something called the Pact for the Future. And they're also expected to declare a planetary emergency. This is all coming on discussions over the last few years, since at least 2022. You can go back to 2020 and find some of it as well, from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said that it is time to shift financial resources to rapidly complete the Agenda 2030 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were set by the United Nations in 2015. In September 2021, the Secretary General released his report titled Our Common Agenda, which called for the acceleration of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and the commitments contained in the United Nations 75th Declaration. Our Common Agenda also called for a Summit of the Future so they could, quote, forge a new global consensus on readying ourselves for a future that is rife with risks, but also opportunities. And they said that the Pact of the Future will be, quote, a world and international system that is better prepared to manage the challenges we face. Now, you're going to see that, like usual, these technocrats, they want to keep us all in fear. And we've got, this term we've been hearing for multiple years now from the World Economic Forum, what they call a polycrisis. We're facing a polycrisis of rising climate disasters, economic turmoil, wars, pandemics, disease, things like that. And it's just getting so crazy that we can't have individual nation states deciding on how to respond and what steps to take. We need to have a multilateral global governance system, which is just another way to say world government. Instead of unilateral, one country acting, no, we need this multilateral system, which, hey, let's be honest, maybe that would be a good thing for us if we didn't have psychopaths running the world and managing the individual nation states or being puppets for the people who really manage the nation states. If that wasn't our reality, then sure, the idea of some peaceful global governance situation where we could, take humanity into the future and build a better planet like we all know is possible, that would be great. But you're not going to take the United States, China, Russia, and some of these authoritarian nations, which are increasingly authoritarian, throw them all into a blender and get out peaceful world government. I'm sorry, it's not going to work that way, my friends. That is not what's in the cards for us, at least not through the United Nations. This is likely to be another shift towards a world governed by unelected internationalist politicians. And as I said, the UN member states are likely to vote on radically altering the UN itself, what they're calling UN 2.0, and to change the very way that nation states make decisions about the planet. They've also recently announced that they have something called the Global Digital Compact, which they say is all about establishing an inclusive internet for multi-stakeholders. And they promise it's going to be open, free, secure, and human-centered. And it's going to help complete the Sustainable Development Goals. They've also talked about having an agreement for the future generations. They're making big moves. They're making big plans. Now, this is what is so important about the Summit of the Future, my friends. This call for an emergency platform and the declaration of a planetary emergency. I think this is probably the most potentially dangerous aspect of the Summit of the Future and the so-called Pact of the Future. Now, I previously reported that there was a zero draft version of this document. The Pact of the Future was released back in, I think, February, maybe March. And in that document, the United Nations is calling for an emergency platform that they say will be activated in the event of, quote, such a shock that it has an impact on multiple regions of the world and, according to the UN, requires a, quote, coherent, coordinated, and multidimensional response. And this draft document of the Pact for the Future also says that the emergency platform, they promise it's not going to be a standing institution or a body, and they promise that it'll fully respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity and the political independence of the states. Trust the UN if you want. However, they're not the only ones calling for this. You have groups like the Climate Governance Commission, which are also promoting this planetary emergency. And here's a few interesting facts on the Climate Governance Commission. It was convened originally by a woman named Maha Graf, who's a member of the Global Governance Forum, which has extensive connections to technocracy, to the technocratic state, including the Rockefeller Foundation. And the Rockefeller Foundation helped fund the work of the Climate Governance Commission. I'm like updating my article here in real time. Excuse me. I'm like noticing I left out some words. Oh gosh. The Climate Governance Commission was funded by the Rockefellers, and this makes perfect sense if you recall my reporting from 2023 when I wrote that the Rockefeller Foundation has made it clear that the climate agenda is their new focus. And of course, the Stimson Center is also a close collaborator with the Climate Governance Commission. So I need to map this out, but you've got the UN, you've got groups like the Climate Governance Commission, you got the Stimson Center, you got the Rockefeller Foundation, and each of them are kind of like in this feedback loop, feeding information, then publishing pieces, getting it out there, getting politicians to pay attention. So this is my piece back in 2023. Rockefeller Foundation's new focus on climate change signals the next phase of the Great Reset. And that is what I think we're seeing here. So in November 2023, right before the UN COP28, the Climate Governance Commission released a report titled Governing Our Planetary Emergency, and they continue to advocate for updating our ideas on governance, specifically the idea that we need to move beyond nation states. And under this document, again, Governing Our Planetary Emergency, under a section titled Near-Term International Governance Innovations, it says that, quote, we urge the UN General Assembly at the 2024 Summit of the Future to declare a planetary emergency, recognizing that the triple planetary crisis poses a grave risk to global stability and security, among others, to be reinforced in similar statements by bodies and agencies of the UN. They also echo the call for the emergency platform, which I told you about is in the zero draft version of the Pact for the Future. And they recommend convening a, quote, planetary emergency platform to address rapidly accelerating consequences of climate change. Now, look, my friends, here's a little history, conspiracy history, or just eugenics history, if you will. If you go back and you do the research, you start looking into groups like the Club of Rome. What you're going to find out is that these organizations are actually the originators of this idea of declaring a planetary emergency and this so-called polycrisis. Recently, the Climate Governance Commission put out a report, again, November 2023, that they said the belief in a polycrisis is, quote, recognized in the work of the Club of Rome Planetary Emergency Project. Well, let's look at that. The Planetary Emergency Project was established in 2019 when the Club of Rome published something called the Planetary Emergency Plan. And then they had updated it 1 year later, August 2020, at the very beginning of COVID-19 84. The Club of Rome's emergency plan is described as, quote, a roadmap for governments and other stakeholders to shift our societies and economies to bring back balance between people, planet, and prosperity. And again, the Club of Rome calls for a planetary emergency. They say the plan should, quote, be founded on the urgent need to at least have greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. These extreme calls for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon, have led many researchers, including myself, to conclude that the guiding philosophy of the Club of Rome is actually a belief in eugenics masked by a faux environmental agenda. And I'm going to repeat some of the information I shared before. For those of you who are well versed in the Club of Rome, it'll be familiar. If not, this will be new to you. The Club of Rome was founded in 1968. And they actually played a major role in the development of the more well-known World Economic Forum. And on the 50th anniversary of the World Economic Forum, they actually looked back on their history and they detailed how much of a role the Club of Rome played. They note that at their 1973 meeting, they had Aurelio Pesci, he's an Italian industrialist, my Italian's not great, who founded the Club of Rome with Alexander King, and they presented a speech on his now infamous book, The Limits to Growth. Alexander King was also responsible for a follow-up report which was released in 1991 titled The First Global Revolution. And it's this report that has a section titled The Common Enemy of Humanity is Man. And this is what it says. And again, I'll preface this by saying the Club of Rome claims that this following quote is taken out of context and that they're not saying that we needed to conspire to make people convinced that humanity is the problem, but rather that they're just observing humanity is its own worst enemy. I'll let you decide. Again, the section is titled The Common Enemy of Humanity is Man from 1991 by the Club of Rome. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and in their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which demands the solidarity of all peoples. But in designating them as the enemy, we fall into the trap about which we have already warned, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. What do you guys think? I mean, it sounds pretty clear. They're saying, in searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, threat of global warming, would fit the bill. That sounds pretty plain to me, but you guys decide. So now let's wrap this up. What comes after the Summit of the Future? I'm not saying that on September 21st, this is all of a sudden we're going to end up in world government and the world's over or anything like that. I'm not spreading that fear porn, that doomsday porn. But this is absolutely a major step towards the creation of a world government. It will be one of many steps to come. In fact, in the recent, some of my recent investigations, I'm finding that the UN's already talking about 2025 meetings in 2026 because this is all building towards 2030. Remember that back in 2020, the United Nations and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation declared that this is the decade of transformation. They are trying to transform the world for this net zero agenda, for the carbon credits, and for all the things that we know, the technocratic state. And they're going to use fake pandemics or exaggerated pandemics or war or crises or whatever they want, including climate change, to implement that agenda. Carbon credits, for example, you go back and study the original technocracy movement, they talked about having energy credits and energy rations, but at that time, they didn't have the technology to implement this. Guess what we have now? Artificial intelligence, digital technology infrastructure. This can make the technocratic plan come to life. This is why we must resist it. This is why we must opt out. Now, I'm going to read to you guys the final part of the article. For those who know my writing style, I stick to the facts, but then if you make it all the way to the end, I try to make it a little more optimistic or inspiring. So this is what I wrote. One thing is clear, the Summit of the Future, the Pact for the Future, and the declaration of a planetary emergency needs more attention, and fast. Otherwise, the free-thinking people of the world will be in the same position that we have often found ourselves, looking back to the past with the benefit of hindsight, wishing that we had paid attention before it was too late to stop the advancement of the technocratic state. If we want to meaningfully challenge the Stimson Center, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, and the many other tentacles of this shadow government octopus, first, we must spread this knowledge as far and wide as possible as quickly as we can. That means share this video, share my article when it comes out tomorrow. Go to my website, go to TLAB, find my previous reporting, share it with your friends and family, do your own content, do your own video breakdowns about it. With less than 60 days until the UN Summit of the Future and a potential declaration of a planetary emergency, we must do what we can to educate the public about this meeting and the danger that it poses to national sovereignty and thus individual sovereignty. And beyond educating the masses, we must also prepare for the potential that the Great Reset, Agenda 2030, and the Fourth Industrial Revolution proposed by the UN and the WEF cabal will become a reality in some form or another. This is not to say that we ought to give up and cede our liberties to the technocrats. Rather, we should recognize that electoral politics and voting for presidential puppets will not lead to liberty in our lifetime or for future generations. Instead, we ought to put our energy into the creation of alternative, parallel systems which can compete with the technocratic state directly. And this is why I'm helping produce the People's Reset UK, our summit for the future, our summit for our future, which some of you may have heard me talking about recently. In fact, I was on Neil Oliver's show, Scottish broadcaster recently. Dan Aston Gregory, who I'm working with this, was on James Corbett's show this last week. We're getting the word out. And this summit for our future, the People's Reset, is happening the week after the UN's Summit for Our Future. So their summit is happening in New York City. The week after, we're meeting in Bath, UK, in person. If you can come, check it out. If not, it's going to be streamed for free online all over the world, like all of our events. And this is 3 days, 24 presenters focusing on solutions for creating parallel systems in the area of health, finance, education, digital technology, community building. There's a lot of different areas we're going to take that. And together, if we do that, if we focus our energy on these parallel alternative systems, I believe we actually can create a better world. But I don't think it's going to come. In fact, I know it's not going to come if we keep banging our head against the wall and playing the same old slave games and thinking that somehow we're going to beat these people through the political system, even though they created this very system to be corrupted in this exact way. So that is what the Summit of the Future is, my friends, and I encourage you to learn more about it. That article will be published at the lastamericanvagabond.com by tomorrow morning. For those of you who are seeing this later, it's probably up. And I'll just show you a couple other things on screen. These are things from the UN website that I pulled up. Press release: ahead of the Summit of the Future, countries commit to accelerate their delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is another one on the Summit of the Future. Like I said, they're working on something called the Declaration on Future Generations. I'm going to be paying attention to this because, knowing these people, it's probably not good. And they've also got this one, the Global Digital Compact. They've also released the zero draft of that as well. So that is some more of what the heck is going on there with the crazy UN folks.